I allowed her to do this to me. I'm actually to blame in some ways because my happy life mindset contributes to the downfall of my marriage. However, her failure to take accountability for her own actions further increases my ability to let go. I can barely look at her now. I had always thought of myself as someone who valued peace, stability, and harmony above all else. Growing up, I had witnessed the turmoil of my parents' volatile relationship, their arguments echoing through the house, their bitterness spilling into the way they interacted with each other. I promised myself that when I grew up, I wouldn't repeat that cycle. I would make sure that my own relationship was different, that it would be peaceful, full of love, and free from the constant turmoil I had witnessed. But somewhere along the way, I had lost my sense of self in the process. I had absorbed this concept of happy wife, happy life, thinking that the key to a successful marriage was in making sure she was always content, always fulfilled. I gave up pieces of myself, bit by bit, trying to avoid conflict, trying to be the perfect husband by putting her needs above my own. I thought that as long as she was happy, everything would be fine. In the beginning, it seemed to work. She was radiant, eager to build a life together, and I was happy to take a back seat to her dreams and desires. I told myself that her happiness would be my happiness. But over time, that dynamic began to erode the foundation of our relationship. I started to lose sight of who I was, and in doing so, I lost my sense of purpose. My needs and desires became secondary to hers, and I convinced myself that this was how it had to be. I had grown accustomed to silencing my own voice, pretending everything was fine while my own inner world was quietly unraveling. As the years passed, the cracks in our marriage began to show. Her demands grew, and with each request, each criticism, I found myself bending further, stretching myself thinner, trying to make her happy, sometimes to the detriment of my own well-being. The house became a battleground of unmet expectations, of silence and resentment festering beneath the surface. I kept pretending everything was fine, kept telling myself that this was just a phase, that if I tried harder, everything would work out. But no matter how much I tried, nothing seemed to change. She became more distant, more cold. Her emotional needs seemed to become all-consuming, and I couldn't keep up. The more I gave, the more she demanded, until there was nothing left of me to offer. My sense of self had diminished entirely. I was no longer the person I used to be, and I barely recognized the man I had become. There were moments of clarity, moments when I realized how deeply I had allowed myself to be shaped by her. I had given her control, let her dictate the terms of our relationship. I thought I was doing the right thing, sacrificing my own happiness to ensure hers, but I had allowed myself to be manipulated, to be gaslighted. And even though I recognized this, I couldn't stop myself. I thought that by continuing to give in, by continuing to sacrifice, things would get better. But they never did. Her behavior became more erratic over time. She would become upset over the smallest things, her anger flaring at the slightest provocation, and I found myself walking on eggshells, constantly trying to avoid triggering her. I did everything I could to keep the peace, to avoid the arguments that seemed inevitable, but it never worked. The fights became more frequent, and her criticisms became sharper, more personal. No matter how much I tried to appease her, it was never enough. Nothing was ever enough. It wasn't just the emotional strain. It was the silence that came after each argument. The coldness, the lack of intimacy, the inability to communicate. We had become strangers to each other, and I felt a growing chasm between us that I could no longer ignore. As much as I tried to protect the marriage, as much as I tried to hold on to the version of her I had fallen in love with, it felt like I was constantly chasing a ghost. She had become someone else, someone I didn't recognize, someone who no longer cared about my feelings, my needs, or even my existence. Her world revolved around her own pain, her own frustrations, and I was nothing more than a backdrop to it. What hurt the most, though, wasn't just the distance between us, or the emotional toll it had taken on me. It was the fact that she never took responsibility for any of it. She never acknowledged the damage she had caused, the way her behavior had pushed me to the brink. It was always my fault, always something I had done, always something I hadn't done. She blamed me for everything. Even when I tried to have an honest conversation, to share how I felt, she would turn it around, accuse me of being selfish, of not understanding her. There was no accountability, no remorse. It was always me, always my fault. And as time went on, I started to realize something that was both painful and liberating. I had allowed her to do this to me. I had allowed her to control the narrative of our marriage, to manipulate me into believing that my needs didn't matter. I had allowed myself to be broken down piece by piece, convinced that if I just gave more, sacrificed more, things would get better. I had allowed her to take everything from me, my peace, my identity, my self-worth, and in doing so, I had become a shell of the person I used to be. I could barely look at her now, not because I didn't love her, but because I didn't know her anymore. The woman I had once known, the woman I had fallen in love with, was lost in a sea of emotional turbulence and unresolved pain. And I had lost myself in trying to keep her afloat. I had ignored my own pain, my own needs, in favor of hers, and now there was nothing left. I had sacrificed everything, and it had cost me my sense of self. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to blame her completely for everything that had gone wrong. But I couldn't, because deep down, I knew that I was just as responsible. I had allowed this to happen. I had allowed the cycle to continue. And I had let her, time and time again, make me feel like I wasn't enough. I had let her break me down until I didn't know how to fix myself. As I sat in the silence of our house, the weight of it all crashed down on me. I realized that I couldn't keep going like this. I couldn't keep trying to fix something that was beyond repair. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when it was clear that it wasn't. But breaking free, letting go, was terrifying. It meant acknowledging the truth that I had been living in a toxic, one-sided relationship for far too long. It meant accepting the fact that I had let myself be consumed by someone else's pain, someone else's needs, and I had lost my way in the process. But as painful as it was, I knew that I couldn't continue to ignore my own needs any longer. I had to choose myself. I had to reclaim the pieces of me I had sacrificed in order to survive. And for the first time in a long time, I knew that letting go was the only way to heal. It was the hardest decision I would ever have to make, but I realized that it was the only one that would allow me to rebuild my life, to rediscover who I was, and to finally find peace. The days that followed were filled with a kind of numbness I had never experienced before. I woke up each morning with a sinking feeling in my stomach, knowing that the life I had built, one of compromise, of sacrificing my own happiness for hers, was no longer sustainable. It wasn't just the constant emotional drain anymore, or the tension in the air every time she walked into the room. It was the crushing realization that I had given away so much of myself, that I had allowed the walls of this marriage to close in around me until I couldn't breathe. As I looked at her, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were two people living parallel lives, each one trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. She had become a stranger to me, but I also felt like a stranger to myself. The man I had been, strong, hopeful, independent, felt like a distant memory. I was no longer sure of who I had become or how I had allowed things to go this far. In the silence of our house, I began to see the truth more clearly. The cracks had been there all along, buried beneath the surface of our everyday interactions, but I had ignored them. I had tried to patch them up, to make everything look fine on the outside, but I had never addressed the real issues. The imbalance, the emotional manipulation, the lack of accountability. I had allowed it all to fester. It became harder and harder to look at her, to be in the same room. Every glance, every interaction felt like a reminder of how far we had fallen. The woman I had once adored, the woman I had thought would be my partner for life, was someone I could barely recognize. Her emotional instability, her failure to take responsibility for her actions, and her constant blaming of me for everything had drained all the love I had for her. What remained was a hollow feeling, a space where affection used to be, filled only with resentment and bitterness. I began to avoid her whenever I could, retreating to a corner of our home, trying to find solace in the smallest moments of peace I could muster. My thoughts became consumed with the question, how had I let this happen? How had I allowed myself to be so deeply submerged in her world, in her chaos, that I lost sight of who I was? I knew the answer. It was my own fear. Fear of confrontation, fear of change, fear of the unknown. I had feared that without her, I would be nothing, that I would lose everything I had worked for. I had made excuses for her behavior, justified her anger, her paranoia, her inability to be present. I told myself it was just a phase, that things would get better, but they never did. They only got worse. One night, as I sat in the dark, reflecting on everything that had brought us here, I realized something that was both freeing and devastating. I wasn't trapped by her. I wasn't trapped by the marriage. I was trapped by my own choices. I had chosen to stay. I had chosen to allow her behavior to dictate my life. I had chosen to suppress my own needs, my own voice, all in the name of preserving a relationship that no longer existed. It was a harsh truth, but it was one I had to face. It was in that moment of clarity that I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep suffocating under the weight of a marriage that had long since lost its foundation. I had to let go not just of her, but of the version of myself that I had allowed to disappear. I had to rediscover who I was without her. I had to find a way to heal, to rebuild, and to reclaim the peace I had lost. The thought of leaving her, of breaking the fragile bond we had, was terrifying. I feared the fallout, the accusations, the guilt. But deep down, I knew that staying would only continue to destroy me. I couldn't fix her. I couldn't make her see the truth. I couldn't change her behavior. The only thing I could control was my own life, my own choices. And I knew that I had to make a choice that would allow me to breathe again, to find a future where I wasn't consumed by the emotional turmoil of this toxic relationship. The day I finally made the decision to leave was the hardest of my life. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation I had always imagined it would be. There were no shouting matches, no violent outbursts. It was quiet, almost serene, but the weight of it was suffocating. As I packed my things, I felt like I was shedding a skin I had worn for far too long, and underneath it, I was raw, vulnerable, but also relieved. It felt like I was taking back a piece of myself that had been lost for years. Leaving her wasn't just about escaping the chaos of our marriage. It was about reclaiming my own identity, my own peace, and my own happiness. I had spent so long trying to fix something that was beyond repair, trying to make a broken person whole, that I had neglected the most important relationship I had, the one with myself. I knew that there would be no easy resolution, no clean break. The aftermath would be messy, painful, and complicated. There would be moments of doubt, moments when I questioned my decision, moments when I missed the comfort of the life we had built, even if that life was suffocating. But I had to trust that, in time, the peace I was seeking would find me. As I walked away, the weight on my chest slowly began to lift. It wasn't instant, and it wasn't perfect. But every step I took away from her, every moment of silence, was a step closer to the man I had once been, the man I was still capable of becoming again, the man who had dreams, who had a voice, who knew his worth. I had allowed her to take so much from me, but now I was taking it back. And as painful as it was, I knew that letting go was the only way forward. I had to trust that in time, I would heal. And as I looked ahead, though uncertain of the future, I felt a small flicker of hope. It was a hope that had been buried beneath years of emotional neglect, but it was there. A hope that, someday, I would find peace again. A peace that wasn't dictated by anyone else's expectations. A peace that came from within. The days after I left her were a blur of conflicting emotions. There were moments of overwhelming relief, where I felt the tension in my chest slowly ebbing away, as if the weight I had been carrying for so long was finally lifting. But there were also moments of guilt, sharp and biting, that threatened to undo the peace I had worked so hard to reclaim. I questioned if I had made the right choice, if walking away from the marriage was the right thing. For me, for her, I was still haunted by the thought that maybe, just maybe, I could have fixed things if I had tried harder. But I knew deep down that the life I had been living was unsustainable. The emotional abuse, the manipulation, the constant blame, it was not something I could have changed. It wasn't my fault, but still, the guilt clung to me like a shadow. I spent the first few weeks in a haze, trying to adjust to a life that was no longer dictated by her needs or her moods. It felt strange to not have her in my life every day, strange to have an entire apartment to myself after years of sharing space with someone. The silence was overwhelming at first, deafening in its stillness. I had been so used to the noise of our arguments, the tension that hung in the air, that it was disorienting to be alone. But slowly, the silence became less suffocating. I began to enjoy the small freedoms, the freedom to do what I wanted without fear of triggering her, the freedom to think, without constantly second-guessing myself. But as time passed, the loneliness started to creep in. The moments when I would remember the good times, the love I once felt for her, were the hardest. It was like mourning a loss, mourning the person I had once believed she was, mourning the love I had thought we shared. There were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wishing things had turned out differently. I had wanted so badly for it to work, to be the husband she needed, to be the man I thought she deserved, but I couldn't fix her, and I couldn't fix us. I knew it was normal to feel sad, to grieve the end of a chapter in my life. I had loved her once, deeply. And even though the love had long since been overshadowed by pain, I couldn't just erase those years from my memory. But I also knew that I couldn't allow myself to fall into the trap of wishing things were different. The truth was that we both played a role in the breakdown of our marriage. Yes, she had been emotionally abusive, and yes, she had failed to take accountability for her actions, but I had let it happen. I had allowed myself to be swallowed by the idea that I had to make her happy at all costs, and in doing so, I had lost myself. I had been too afraid of confronting the truth for too long, too afraid of what would happen if I stood up for myself. And now, as painful as it was, I had to accept that both of us had failed each other. But I also knew that staying in that relationship would have destroyed me completely. The person I had become in that marriage, small, invisible, constantly on edge, was not the person I wanted to be. I had to rebuild myself, piece by piece, and for the first time in years, I felt a spark of something deep inside me, hope. Hope that I could find my voice again, hope that I could learn to love myself, to stand up for myself, and to trust that I was worthy of peace and happiness. It wouldn't be easy. There would be days when the weight of the past would threaten to drag me down, days when I would wonder if I was truly capable of healing. But I had to remind myself that healing wasn't linear. It wasn't something that could be rushed, and it wasn't something I had to do alone. I would lean on friends, I would seek therapy, and I would give myself the time and space I needed to recover. As the weeks turned into months, I began to notice subtle changes in myself. I was rediscovering old hobbies that I had once loved but abandoned in favor of trying to keep the peace in my marriage. I was spending more time with friends, reconnecting with people I had pushed away over the years. I was starting to feel a sense of joy again, even if it was small at first. I was starting to remember what it felt like to live for me, but there were also setbacks. I would have days where I doubted myself, days when I missed her, even though I knew in my heart that it was better this way. The loneliness would wash over me like a tidal wave, and I would question if I was truly better off without her. I longed for the companionship we once had, for the intimacy we had shared, even though I knew it had been laced with toxicity. It was hard not to miss the familiarity, even if that familiarity had been built on a foundation of emotional neglect. And then, there were the days when I would think back to the years of emotional abuse and the way it had slowly chipped away at me, at my spirit, at my soul. I realized that I wasn't the only one who had been damaged in the relationship. She, too, had suffered. But she hadn't taken responsibility for her actions, hadn't sought help or acknowledged her role in the destruction of our marriage. That was something I couldn't change, and I had to accept that. In the end, I had to accept that the person I had loved had never truly existed, at least not in the way I had imagined. The woman I had married was not the woman I thought she was. She had her own demons, her own struggles, but she had never been willing to face them. She had projected all of her pain onto me, expecting me to fix it, to absorb it, and I had let her. I had let myself be consumed by her needs, her emotions, until I was nothing. But now, I was learning how to take back my life, one day at a time. I had to let go of the past, of the what-ifs, of the dreams I had held onto for so long. I had to learn to forgive myself, to stop blaming myself for things I couldn't control. I had allowed myself to be in that toxic relationship, but I didn't have to stay in it forever. I had made the decision to leave, to choose my own peace. And as I slowly began to rebuild, I knew that it would take time, but I was finally on the path to healing. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was going to be okay.